Here we go. One step at a time, don't be living on the line.
In this video lesson, we're going to go into details about how a firm in a perfectly competitive market can earn profits in the short run, but is only going to break even in the long run due to the very nature of the market structure on which it is competing. So in a previous lesson, we talked about how in a market for a particular good, if it is perfectly competitive, the price determined by the market supply and the market demand for the good, in our graph we'll call that PE, and the quantity, QE, determines the price and the marginal revenue as seen by an individual firm competing in that market. Firms in perfectly competitive markets, as was explained in a previous lesson, are what we call price takers. They must accept the price for their product determined by the total market for the product that they are competing in. So the demand, as seen by an individual firm, is actually perfectly elastic. It also represents the marginal revenue. In other words, the revenue an individual seller receives from the sale of each additional unit of output. Regardless of how much output this firm produces, it will always be able to sell its good for a price of PE, which is determined by the market, including hundreds of other sellers just like that one firm. So when illustrating perfectly competitive markets and firms, we always draw two diagrams, one for the market representing the hundreds or even thousands of sellers of the product in question and the demand from the thousands or even millions of consumers for that product. But we also draw a diagram for an individual firm in which the demand and the marginal revenue, we'll call this MR equals D, are equal to the equilibrium price determined by the market. So anytime we draw an individual firm diagram, we must take into account the firm's costs of production. So there are three cost curves we generally illustrate in a firm diagram. The most important being the marginal cost. So the marginal cost for any particular firm's product slopes downwards at first due to increasing marginal returns and then upwards due to diminishing marginal returns. In addition to marginal cost, we're also interested in the average variable cost, which, as explained in previous lessons, begins at the same point as marginal cost, but then slopes downwards until it intersects marginal cost, at which point it slopes upwards. So we'll call that AVC, the average variable cost. Finally, the third and perhaps the most important cost that a particular firm or an individual firm is concerned with is its average total cost. This is the per unit cost of a firm's output. So the average total cost begins above the average variable cost, slopes downwards until it intersects the marginal cost curve, and then as additional units cost more than the average cost per unit, the average total cost rises, yet gets closer and closer to average variable cost due to the fact that average fixed costs are decreasing as output increases. So those are the three cost curves that an individual firm will face in the short run. And when we combine that with the average and marginal revenue curve of MR equals D, we can determine, following the profit maximization rule as explained in a previous lesson, that a firm in the short run will always wish to produce at its profit maximizing quantity, which will be at the intersection of MR and MC. This is the best a particular firm can hope to do in the short run if it wishes to maximize its profits. So in our perfectly competitive firm, the profit maximizing quantity is right here at QE. Now we can assume that QE, we'll call that QEF actually. That's the equilibrium quantity that the firm produces. QEF times the number of firms in the market will equal QE. We can assume that if there are 1,000 identical firms, each following the profit maximization rule and producing at their MR equals MC point, then those 1,000 firms, when combined, their total output will equal the market output of QE. That's just a little helpful way to think of the relationship between an individual firm and the output in the market. So let's look at the situation that our firm here on the right is facing. Let's determine whether or not our firm on the right is earning economic profits, earning economic losses, or breaking even. In fact, if we look closely at the profit maximizing point here of MR equals MC, we should notice also that in addition to the price equals the marginal cost, and it equals the average total cost. This firm's average revenue, the price, that's another word for price, it's average revenue minus its average total cost equals 0. What does that mean for this firm? That means this firm is breaking even. No profits, no economic profits, in other words. Our firm here is breaking even. This firm is covering all of its explicit costs of production, the wages it pays its workers, the rent it pays its landlord, the interest it's paying the bank for any capital that it borrowed, and a normal profit, which is the cost needed to keep the entrepreneur in this market. This firm is breaking even. Now, this is actually the outcome that is expected to occur in a perfectly competitive market. Due to the nature of competition and the low barriers to entry in such a market, firms are not expected to earn substantial amounts of economic profits, especially in the long run. So what we've shown here, a firm producing at its minimum average total cost. In fact, this is not just any old ATC. This is actually the minimum average total cost. This firm cannot possibly hope to earn economic profits by increasing or decreasing its output. Notice, for example, that if this firm decreased its output from QE to Q1, its average total costs would increase. And since this firm is a price taker, at this quantity, its average total cost is greater than its average revenue, and this firm would be earning economic losses. On the other hand, if this firm chose to increase its output to Q2, it would also begin experiencing losses, because over here we can see clearly that ATC is greater than average revenue. This firm cannot earn economic profits. But what could happen in the market that could lead to the existence of economic profits for an individual firm in a perfectly competitive market? It should be quite clear to see that if something were to happen in the market that led to an increase in demand for this firm's output, then the demand for the individual firm's output would rise, the marginal revenue, the average revenue, and the price it could sell its output for would increase, and this firm could go from breaking even to earning economic profits. Let's clean up our graphs here and show what would happen if demand increased for this product in the short run. Okay, so let's look at our graph on the left, the market diagram. Let's ask the question, what happens if total demand in the market for this good rises? Well, the good would become more scarce. An increase in the demand for this good from D to D1 causes the market price, the equilibrium price, to rise from PE to P1. And as we're going to see, the market quantity supplied will increase, but we'll show why that is the case in just a moment. In the short run, we'll expect the quantity to increase. But how does that look on an individual firm's diagram? An increase in the price from PE to P1 corresponds with an upward shift of the individual firm's marginal revenue curve. So we'll see a new demand curve, which is horizontal at the new equilibrium price. So we'll shift our demand curve up. Okay, there we go. And we'll call that MR equals D1. MR1 equals D1. We've got a new marginal revenue and demand curve as seen by each of the individual firms in this market. Notice that it is still horizontal at the market equilibrium price. But how do the individual firms respond to the higher level of demand for the good in the market? Well, as we see, there is a new quantity at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The firms are profit maximizers, so they'll want to continue to produce where MR equals MC, but that now corresponds with the greater quantity for each individual firm. So whereas before the increase in demand, each firm was producing QEF, now each firm will produce QEF1. Each individual firm has an incentive to increase its production due to the increase in demand for the good in the market. Now, what happens to the individual firm's level of economic profits following this increase in market price? Well, to find out the effect that this has on profits, we must determine what happens to the firm's average total costs as it increases its output in the short run. And as we see, there is no immediate effect on the cost curves themselves. Rather, what happens is we move along this firm's average total cost curve. It is no longer going to be producing at its minimum ATC, but as we move along the ATC, we'll see that the firm's new average total cost is a little bit higher than it was before, but it is lower than the firm's new average revenue, or the price it can sell its product for. So now this firm has gone from breaking even to a situation where its average revenue is greater than its average total cost. So this means that the firm is earning economic profits. It is no longer only breaking even. The entire area representing this firm's economic profits can be illustrated as the distance between the new price of P1 and the firm's average total cost when it's producing a QEF1, and we can multiply that by the quantity, and this yellow rectangle shows us the individual firm's economic profits following the increase in the market price. So this now represents economic profits. In other words, the profits above and beyond all of these firms' explicit and implicit costs of production. In the short run, in response to an increase in the demand for the product in the market, each individual firm will increase its output and earn economic profits. But what will happen in the long run? If these profits are being earned, we should expect that new firms will be attracted to this market. Remember, one of the primary characteristics of perfect competition is that there are no barriers to entry. And in the existence of economic profits, new firms will wish to enter this market. If you recall from earlier in the course, one of the determinants of supply for a good is the number of firms in a market. If the number of firms increases in this market, the market supply curve will shift to the right, as we see here in our graph on the left. So due to the existence of new economic profits, the number of firms in this market will increase. Firms are attracted to these economic profits. Therefore, the supply in the market will increase in the long run. Remember, that's the variable plant period, the period of time over which new firms can enter this market. And as the supply increases, bad news for the firms that are already in the market, those firms which were experiencing economic profits in the short run, the equilibrium price will fall once again. So what we see happen is that the entrance of new firms leads to a lower equilibrium price, and it should return to its original price of PE. This means that for the individual firms, the marginal revenue and demand for their products will fall. Due to increased competition, each individual firm has an even smaller market share. So we can say bye-bye to these economic profits. As new firms enter, the existing firms see demand for their products fall, and economic profits disappear. The marginal revenue will shift back down to its original level. So all of this will disappear due to the existence of new firms in this market. The firms that were in the short run experiencing profits go back to breaking even. So we'll go right back to where we were. Now this is a continuous cycle. It's evidence that perfectly competitive firms can never hope to earn economic profits in the long run. If profits exist in the short run, firms will enter the market, increasing the market supply, driving the price back down to its original equilibrium level and eliminating those profits. So I teach my students that there's a very easy way to remember what happens to economic profits in the long run if they exist in a perfectly competitive market. 3 words: entry eliminates profits. If profits exist, new firms will enter the market and eliminate those profits. Now, we are left with the question, what happens in the long run in perfect competition? In the long run, what will always happen is that output will always return to a level at which the individual firms are producing at their minimum average total cost. If firms are producing at a quantity at which their average total cost is at its lowest point, then there is essentially no hope for these firms of earning economic profits. There's no way that this firm here can lower its costs below what they are already achieving at QEF. If they increase their output, their average total cost will rise, as we see here. If they decrease their output, their average total cost will rise, as we see here. This firm is minimizing its costs, therefore it is doing as good as it can do given the market supply and demand for its product. The only way it can earn profits is if demand increases in the short run, and then those profits would be eliminated in the long run due to the entrance of new firms. So what happens if a firm goes from breaking even, as we see here, to earning economic losses? We're going to clean up the graph one more time and show what happens if losses are experienced in the short run by firms in a perfectly competitive market. So now we are in the long run equilibrium in a perfectly competitive market. We can see that the firms are breaking even in this market. They're doing as good as they can possibly hope to do by producing at their marginal revenue equals their marginal cost level of output. But what could happen in this market to reduce this firm's well-being, to take this firm from a break-even point to a loss earning level? Clearly, all that would take is a decrease in the demand for the product. So a decrease in the market demand causes the equilibrium price in the market to fall to P2, bringing down the level of marginal revenue and average revenue experienced by the individual firms. So this firm, which is one of hundreds, maybe even thousands just like it, will go from a high level of demand of MR equals D to a much lower level of demand of MR2 equals D2. Now, in response to the lower demand for its product, the firm will reduce its output. The marginal revenue curve moves downwards, and in order to maintain its profit maximizing level of output, the firm must decrease the quantity that it produces. So we move down and to the left along the individual firm's marginal cost curve. So this firm will now reduce its output in response to falling demand for its product to QEF2. Now, what happens to this firm's break-even level of economic profits? We saw that at the original equilibrium of QEF, the firm was earning just enough revenues to cover all of its explicit and implicit costs. But bad news for the firms. Due to falling demand for their products, the individual firms will go from breaking even to earning economic losses. So if we draw our dotted line up to the ATC curve and over, we'll see that the firm's average total costs have actually increased due to the lower demand for its product. The firm goes to a smaller level of output, but now, we can see this here, its average total cost is greater than its average revenue. The firm is now earning economic losses. Like I said, bad news. So we can now shade this area. If we want to know the level of economic losses for this firm, we must subtract its total costs from its total revenues, or its average total costs from its average revenues. And we'll see that ATC is greater than AR, therefore the firm is actually earning losses. These firms are now earning economic losses. Their average total cost is greater than their average revenue, meaning that for each unit of output that they produce and sell, they are selling it for less than it costs to produce. Bad news for the firms, but will this be sustained in the long run? The existence of economic losses will ultimately, in the long run, once firms have had time to adjust to the losses being earned, lead to an exit of firms. There will be firms leaving this market in order to get out of this loss earning situation. So there are three words we can now illustrate and understand. Exit eliminates losses. So the bad news will not be such bad news in the long run. The firms that are willing to stick it out will see their losses eliminated due to the exit of firms. Some firms will choose to leave this market, in which case the supply in the market will decrease. The good will once again become more scarce, and the equilibrium price will return to its original level. Now, what does that mean for the firms that stuck it out? The firms that decided not to exit, those firms that stuck it out will see these losses predictably eliminated. As some firms exit the market price will rise, and the demand for the remaining firm's product will return to its original level. So we'll see this marginal revenue curve shift back up with the equilibrium price in the market, and the firms will go back to breaking even. So this is another illustration of how in the long run firms in perfect competition will break even. They won't earn losses in the long run because other firms will exit, some firms will drop out, they'll shut their doors, they'll close their factories, they'll leave the market altogether. So the supply in the market decreases once some firms exit. Those firms that were willing to stick out the hard times, experience losses in the short run, will go right back to the profit maximizing level of P equals minimum ATC. They're not earning profits, but they're also not earning losses. They're earning just enough to stay in the market in the long run. This is an illustration of how exit eliminates losses under perfect competition. There are low barriers to entry in such a market, but also importantly, there are very low barriers to exit. It's easy to open shop and it's easy to close shop. If profits exist, entry will eliminate those profits because new firms will enter the market attracted by the prospect of economic profits. However, if losses exist, exit will eliminate those losses due to the easy exit from such a market. No firm wants to be earning economic losses in the long run. So if they are doing so, some firms will choose to shut down, leave the market, reducing supply, increasing the price back to a break-even point for the remaining firms. Now, in our next lesson, we're going to examine very closely the effect on efficiency of perfect competition. How does all of this short run and long run adjustment that occurs because of profits and losses affect the prospect for economic efficiency in this market structure? We'll examine that in our next lesson.